time of year again. The State of CSS survey for 2020 has come in, and there are some mildly surprising results. Let's have a look at a few thoughts on that. There's a lot of conclusions you can draw from something like this, but I think the initial one is the actual sample size, the number of people or the type of people that respond to something like this. The people that are very industry conscious, the people that are really trying to be cutting edge and stay afloat of all the latest trends, are the kind of people that would be even aware of something like this CSS survey and want to fill it out with all the things that they are using and not using. There's a really interesting article by Charlie Owen. I think it's about the real dark web. Talked about this idea that there's a massive underrepresented group of people in web development who are producing websites but using stable technologies that they would use repeatedly over many years, and they are not constantly trying to look at the bleeding edge and try and adopt all the latest new technologies. They're just staying safe with regular technologies because the projects they work on don't need to be rebuilt, or they need to kind of have some longevity. And they are somewhat underrepresented when you look at tech, social media and forums and discussions, because they're not always burning into the latest libraries and the latest new optimizations. I think that's worth taking on board. You look at the demographics and the kind of breakdown of the people. You've got a largely English, high salary, very experienced, big companies, male, white, but people who they define themselves as being experts in both CSS and JavaScript. So these are people who are experienced developers who've got a full front-end knowledge suite, who are largely in high-paid roles with big companies. So again, you're talking to a very select group, the type of people that follow this, and they're perhaps the people you do want to know about which technologies are buzzing right now, which everyone's liking and what everyone wants to follow. It doesn't necessarily give you the clearest view about where that technology is going, because of even if something's gaining massive adoption, is really popular among this sample size, it still hasn't reached a massive wider adoption in the web. So for example, jQuery is still in use in far more websites than React, for instance, even though that's considered very passé and not supposed to be used anymore because of JS has moved on. React is still very much for kind of bespoke apps for very specific circumstances. You know, more people use WordPress websites, for instance. So there's a potential that you could sort of read too much into these results and start seeing that an industry is shifted towards a technology when it's not entirely the case. Things you can gain from these are just the actual popularity of things, or how things have grown year on year, though, because there your samples are fairly similar and you're just seeing what things people have embraced more, what things people are appreciating more and actually making use of. So the ones that stand out really are Flexbox, transitions, calc, things like font face. These are now at pretty much 100% adoption. These things are no longer kind of cutting edge features or things which are kind of lesser known. These are just standards that people use across the websites. It's not surprising that Flexbox now is a kind of go-to solution for most people in aligning elements, or font face for embedding fonts, or calc for kind of solving layout problems. These are no longer exciting things, and they've reached 100%. The other features section is interesting. So variables has seen an increase in use. So a lot of people have been using variables in the last year, custom properties, to sort of solve very particular problems, but also this seems to be that it does help people organize their CSS or to interact with JavaScript in lots of ways. So that's not too surprising. These other things about will change calc, Houdini, comparison functions, it's really interesting. There's just so many CSS features rolling through at the moment, and they're coming in such rapidity, and some solve very particular accessibility issues or performance issues. Some are kind of more for language features, so they all kind of solve problems which some people perhaps don't have to solve on their particular sites or apps. So it's interesting to see where the adoption rate is for those, and it ultimately tells you whether this is just something that's a nice to have, or something that solves very niche problems, or it is actually as a wider thing being adopted by more people. That's quite interesting. Tailwind is continuing to sneak up the list. So on the grid, it's got high satisfaction but low user count. That's the thing. The people that do use it absolutely love it. You go to CSS methodologies, and atomic CSS and utility-based classes has jumped to the top of the preferred ways of writing CSS. CSS frameworks. Tailwind goes from 81 to 87% of its I think that's satisfaction. So that really has been the thing. I think anyone monitoring any kind of CSS articles and CSS trends at the moment sees that Tailwind in particular, but utility stuff is just going up, and it seems to become really popular. And that's kind of going a little hand in hand with CSS in JS and component-driven CSS. And I wonder if that's wonder if those two are particularly linked. I would assume they are. It's interesting because some might draw the conclusion that it's full stack developers who don't really like CSS are quite happy to just lean on some sort of utility library, which means they can just slap in a bunch of classes and they don't have to think about writing CSS. But utility CSS is not far off writing inline CSS. It's kind of one step removed from you just writing out loads of properties. So there must be an additional benefit here that people find it's very clean, modular, avoids hierarchies, avoids any kind of complexity in your CSS, and it clearly must be, it's got a high satisfaction level. It seems that a lot of people are finding it's solving their CSS problems, or it's helping them. So that's a positive thing, and it's suggests it's not just hype, that this is backed by people's actual appreciation of using that thing. With the actual opinion section though, you just simply base the question of utility classes should be avoided. You've got about 30% saying they agree, about 30%, 31% saying neutral, and then another 30% saying disagree, which suggests there you go, you've got a third of people who are just very much in the utility camp, and another third who are anti. I mean, that's the internet, you've just got strong opinions on either side, and then a third who don't have a strong opinion. And that tells you there that the people who are on board super love it and are super strongly in favour, and then those that don't. And that might be increasingly the case. There's another article recently about there is no normal now, that people are finding things that solve problems, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that everyone adopts one way of working. There isn't necessarily a question about CSS in JS versus not using it. You can see how certain libraries have become more or less popular. The opinions on it seem to suggest people are kind of neutral to relatively happy with it. I would have kind of appreciated some sort of breakdown that suggests people are moving more in favour of CSS in JS or against. Doesn't seem to have been answered. The currently missing question, which we covered in a previous video, container queries is at the top, parent selectors, nesting. I suppose native nesting has been on the list for a long time. There are other things further down, which animation. There are things further down which are things which are in the plan. They just haven't been fully rolled out yet. It suggests people know more about what's coming than what they actually want. What's interesting there is you've got Houdini mentioned there. Houdini and web components are really going to dictate something for the future of CSS about how people choose to structure things and how they choose to implement things based on those technologies. What's so far they're barely even questions. They're barely involved in these surveys, which suggests they haven't broken through to any real awareness or adoption level that anyone sees much value in those for now. So I guess those are the things to watch in coming years. Tailwind is the most adopted technology the last year, and PostCSS once again the most highest satisfaction ratio. I did a previous video. I still yet to meet anyone who themselves implements PostCSS setups as part of anything. Someone did point out that Purge CSS, which is a PostCSS plugin, lets you kind of strip out all the parts of libraries that you're not needing and reduces your CSS, and that does sound like a really valuable thing. So there is something there, but other than that, I've still yet to see like a real value from implementing this yourself, rather than just some sort of built-in plugins, some other things that do implement some PostCSS. Yeah, so there's some thoughts on the State of CSS survey for 2020. It's been interesting to see kind of what rises and falls, and exciting to see what happens next year and what trends develop. But let me know what your thoughts were. Let me know in the comments, and what things you're excited to see coming through CSS in the next year. That's all. Happy Christmas. Ta-ra.